you and me witness paranormal activity. Many people suffer alone, afraid of telling their stories. Their encounters remain locked away, like skeletons tapping lightly on a closet door. Join me, Blake Lewis, as we peel back the veil of our reality, searching through silence.
Good evening, children of the night. Has it been ages?
Feels like it has been. So much has transpired within my life since our last gathering that I felt compelled to grace this crazy-ass world with another gruesome tale to twist your subconscious and further intertwine your souls with the edge of our misunderstood reality. Our realities, for that matter. Not every story has an end. Not every story has a clear beginning. Every story doesn't have right or reasoning behind it in many cases, especially when dealing with supernatural forces at play that the human psyche can't begin to understand. We're not meant to. Tonight's tale is one of such stories that leave questions that remain open-ended and beg those who wish to follow their knowledge of the unknown to test walking forward into the darkest realms where dreams become nightmares. And for some, nightmares manifest into realities. So without further ado, go grab yourself some refreshments, make some popcorn, go snuggle up in your favorite cozy blanket. Tonight we follow Kayla, a soul who happened to open a doorway to the other side by allowing her anguish to almost forfeit her eternal life in vain to make a statement, but instead conjured something far darker than her original intent. Tonight, we all lay our heads in the bed of a broken home. Everything in my life was perfect when I was a child. At least that's what I thought growing up. I loved spending time with my mother and father. I have so many memories of good times that we spent together before my family fell apart. When I was 16, my mother and father began arguing all the time over finances, and my father became very distant. He started staying away from home at night, and when he would return the following day, I would lock myself in my room so I didn't have to hear the chaotic sounds of both he and my mother arguing over where he had been the night before. Their voices would echo throughout the house, and I had to teach myself how to close off my mind so I wouldn't hear the thuds and crashing of objects being thrown throughout the house. I used to cover my ears and hum to try to calm my anxiety, but after a while, my emotions would get the best of me as my tears would gather and begin to stream from my eyes as if someone in my soul began to pull at a rusted lever to my heart. I would break down and my throat would clench so tightly that it became a chore to breathe, and each individual breath was accompanied by a small amount of anxiety. Their fights continued for months, and my happiness began to dwindle. I forgot what joy felt like. I forgot what family life was supposed to be like. It wasn't long after that I started suffering from a great deal of depression, but there was so much negativity in our house that there was no way I could do anything about it. I had no one that I could talk to. One day, it was so bad that I thought about hurting myself. That would show them. My cries for help weren't being heard, so I started to believe that I needed to take drastic measures to gain their attention. I had a terrible burden in my chest that night. That night that I decided I wanted to make that statement. I lit my favorite candle, along with some incense, and turned out my bedroom light. Walked into the kitchen, directly past my mother, opened the silverware drawer, and pulled out the largest steak knife that we had. I slammed the drawer shut, turned around, walked into the hallway, and walked directly past my mother without her even flinching. She was so lost in her own mind, she couldn't even pretend to acknowledge me. I proceeded to walk down the hallway and slam my door to my bedroom behind me. I could hear my father scream for me to keep it down, but he was in the other room, and that was it. They forgot about me. I was lost, broken. It's funny how far a strong family can fall when a couple of cards buckle under the weight of darkness. I placed the blade across my wrist and slowly began to apply pressure. My heart began to race, and I sat there for a moment feeling the cold, razor-thin texture gripping my skin, separating the blade from my tendon. That's when I had my first encounter. I heard a loud clacking sound crack against glass, startling me into twisting my body in the direction of the void of darkness that seemed to engulf the environment outside of my window pane. It was thick and had a feeling to it I find challenging to explain. It radiated in my chest when I fixed my eyes on it, or in it. I couldn't tell. I quickly rose to my feet and gripped the handle of the kitchen knife with both hands, fighting to stabilize my grip on the blade, pointing the sharp tip in the direction of the window while my bones rattled in fright. It was the most thrilling event of my life to that date and pumped an immense amount of adrenaline into my erratic heart. Strangely enough, in that dark moment, I felt more alive than I have ever before. I did something then that I haven't done in years. I called out to my mother. She barged into the room seconds later, diverting my attention away from the presence and into her direction. She immediately asked me what the hell I was doing and looked into the direction of the window with a puzzling expression on her face. When I looked back towards the window, I could clearly see the street light across the street gleaming in the crystal clear twilight. I began to ask if she had seen the presence, but abruptly stopped speaking as I looked into her eyes, and I only saw concern staring back at me as I stood there poised to attack. My mother walked slowly over to me with her arms extended, whispering for me to place the blade into her hand. I could see the trembling concern on her face. "Give me the knife, baby." I immediately tried to explain, but she cut me off, softly asking me to hand over the knife again. I then understood that she was frightened for my sake, what my initial intention for the knife was, so I slowly handed my mother the blade and sat onto my bed, shaking from the entire ordeal. I couldn't shake the event from my thoughts the next day. My mother tried to explain the situation to my father, but he immediately reacted exactly how I knew he would. Said I was unhinged and unstable, even going as far to say that I was partially the reason the family was falling apart. So hilarious coming from a man who drowns his unfaithful lifestyle with an endless collection of beer bottle caps in a water cooler jug. It wasn't long after, everything went back to exactly how it was again. Everything except my emotional state. I couldn't get the experience out of my mind and felt there was a lasting signature on my heart. It was enough to make me nervous throughout every day that followed, leading up to nightfall. Days had begun to pass with nothing happening again, but life between my father and mother had grown out of control. My father began staying out for days at a time, and when he would return home, he would go on drunken rampages, screaming at my mother, convincing her that she was somehow driving a wall between the two of them. His last night in our lives will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was in my room, listening to music on my Walkman, attempting to drown the relentless sounds of arguments out of my mind, when suddenly I began to hear hellish sounds coming through my headphones. The music began to slow, and all I could hear were drawn-out screams reminiscent of suffering and violent clicking. When I looked at my Walkman, I realized the tape was being eaten. So I grabbed it off of the bed, hit the stop button, and ejected the cassette, pulling strands of wrinkled tape out from the tape player's destructive grasp. Immediately placing my conscience back into the poisonous atmosphere, I heard my father scream as if he was being attacked. I sprang to my feet and opened my door to see what was happening between both he and my mother, but was absolutely stunned to see my father dangling from thin air at the end of the hallway, grasping at his neck with wet sounds of gargling and fear bleeding from his vocal cords. As soon as I was able to comprehend what was happening, whatever force was gripping my father's throat released its grasp, allowing his heavy body to limply slam on the floor like a rag doll. He lied there motionless for a moment as my mother, who was screaming uncontrollably, fell to his side and began to shake him violently to gain a response from his lifeless body. As he took in a gaping gasp, her eyes shot up and caught sight of me staring at the two of them from down the dark hallway.
You did this.
She yelled at me, immediately placing the blame of the entire event on my doing.
Why would you do this?
As if I unnaturally choked out my father by means of a psychic nature. I panicked in my thoughts and found it impossible to voice my frustrations at her accusation and remember the fearful look on my father's face when he caught eyes with me, and then quickly turned his head away like he was afraid I would unleash wrath upon him at any moment. I slammed the door, ran to my bed, threw my covers over my head, and sobbed myself to sleep alone in the dark. The house remained dead silent for the remainder of the night. When I awoke the next morning, my father was gone, as usual, but I was scared to walk down the hallway after knowing deep in my heart that something was gripping my father by his throat completely into midair. He was a heavy man, while I was far lighter and obviously more easily able to be thrusted around like a rag doll. I held my door open and called for my mother. Nothing. I called her name again as anxiety began to take over my chest from fear of being alone, but I then heard rustling and shifting sounds moving about in the kitchen. I softly called for my mother again, and she answered me with the most depressed tone I have ever heard.
He's not coming back this time. I'm sure of it.
I stood there in silence for a moment to take in the gravity of the statement.
Your father, he's gone.
I slowly crept into the hallway, gingerly walking past my parents' room while taking note of its frantic state. All of my father's belongings were nowhere to be seen. My mother walked to the edge of the kitchen entrance, staring at me with streams of fresh tears lying down her wrinkled cheeks, freezing me in my tracks.
I'd really like to be alone right now,
she softly spoke. Without hesitation, I slipped back into my room and turned the knob completely to quietly shut my door, slowly allowing the spring to latch the door into place without making any sound. I stayed in my room for the remainder of the day and waited for nightfall. I went to bed early that night. Normally I had my music to help me fall asleep, but after my Walkman's recent malfunction, music was not an option. But the weather outside was favorable for my current situation, with light rain tapping on my window from the end of the late afternoon storm. Into the night, the rain began to subside and I began to fade as I was forced to deal with complete silence. That's when I noticed the sound of water drops tapping on my wooden floor. It was faint, but very irritating when trying to rest. I sat up in my bed and turned over toward the direction of the dripping sounds, and there it was. I could barely make out a dark silhouette hunched over in the corner of my room, but heard it slide on the floor toward me. Once it reached the middle of my room, I could begin to see its distinct features. It was a long, frail entity with twisted legs, bent backward and broken sideways, like they were smashed together in a tragic accident and bound by some chaotic machinery. Almost as if the figure waited for me to acknowledge its existence, it let out a guttural breath of suffering while it emanated gargling sounds filled with anguish as blood dripped onto the floor from its quivering jaw. My heart leapt from my chest as the entity slapped its large hand onto the floor and began to drag its crippled body toward my bedside. I shrieked as loud as I could for my mother, and the demon began to crawl frantically faster. Just as the nightmarish creature reached towards my face, my mother stormed into my room, and for the first time, she saw with her very own eyes the face of the true evil that was haunting my family. She began to scream at the top of her lungs, and the entity pulled its arm back from reaching for me as it glared at my mother, then quickly slithered its twisted form under my bed, leaving a dark path of blood in its path. I stood up onto the bed, jumped over toward my door, and darted into my mother's arms. She pulled me from the doorway and slammed the door behind us as she began to drag me down the hallway towards the front door. My bedroom door flung open in a flash as the creature began to tear down the hallway in our direction while bellowing in a pulsing, low grumble. With its lifeless eyes piercing into my flesh, I couldn't remember how to move. My mother continued to pull me along, stumbling as she ran with my extra weight by her side, but I was frozen in fear. I'd forgotten how to operate altogether. She pulled us to the front door, unlocked the bolt lock, and opened the heavy door as it scraped into the worn-down carpet. Just as we were about to escape, the creature clapped its spindly hand around my entire ankle. I immediately felt an extremely painful burning sensation course through my ligaments, like I was being burnt by flames. My mother pulled me out of the door with all of her might. As the entity's hand crossed the doorframe, it let out a gruesome shriek again, released its grasp of my ankle, and receded into the darkness. The house fell completely silent, as if nothing had been present, and that's when it spoke to us for the first and only time.
You all created me. You will forever live with this burden now. And no matter where you go, I will be watching from the shadows.
My mother hesitated at first, but finally reached into the darkness, grabbed the doorknob, and pulled the heavy door as hard as she could, slamming the entrance shut. We abandoned all of our belongings that night and never returned to the house again. I never did have another encounter with the entity, but have suffered from what I can only explain as reoccurring night terrors and ghost pings from where the creature latched onto my ankle. This experience will torment my mother and my thoughts for the rest of our lives, but it has drawn us closer together. Welcome back. Some tales don't have the happiest of endings and leave us with endless questions as to why the paranormal bleeds into our chaotic lives in the first place. Was this a happy ending compared to the possible ending before the entity manifested? Why did the entity choose to intervene with the family in the first place? Would Kayla have taken her life if it hadn't? Would her father have ever left the broken state of that existence if not for the intervention? Would Kayla and her mother ever have become as close as they now are without a traumatic push? Sometimes evil in its greatest form can also be utilized for a greater purpose. Only Lord knows. And sometimes we are better off without knowing the real answers. I want to thank everyone who listened to the entire webisode and express how much it truly means to me to see my content is striking chords with other like-minded individuals who can't get enough cryptic vibes in their strange lives. I do put a lot of work into these and love hearing your feedback, whether it be encouraging or criticism. I have nothing but love for you guys. And don't forget, creatures, tell me your stories. Write me about your encounters and I'll twist your real-life drama, trauma, and nightmares into a future webisode. But until then, stay safe, sleep well, and keep your wits about you.